Take each game on its merits there.
Hello and welcome to our podcast, Each Game on Its Merits. My name is Eibhilin O'Reardon.
I'm Jerry Farrell.
And we go through every senior international ever played by the FAI since 1924. And now today, Jerry, we are turning to Italy B versus Ireland on Saturday the 27th of April 1927. I have a shirt here which is a replica of what was worn on the day. There you go.
Fetching green number.
Yes, it has Sarah.Aaron written on it, and the tricolour and this fetching sort of colour going on for anybody who's watching our YouTube channel. That's the kind of shirt they would have worn. Now, the background to this game. So, it's played in Lansdowne Road because apparently Dalymount Park is getting an upgrade, which is, nothing ever changes there. Jerry, really, Dalymount Park is always in need of an upgrade. But internationals of the side in Dublin are a bit of a rarity these days, right? So the last game in Dublin was against the Americans in 1924. This is now 1927. There wouldn't be another one for another 2 years until we play Belgium in Dublin. So it's a bit of an event.
Yeah.
Now, this is a kind of a return favour from the Italians because of the game we played last year.
Last episode, if you haven't heard, folks, is Ireland playing Italy A in Turin. It's a 3-0 loss. It's a grueling journey across Central Europe, but they do return the favour. There's an agreement that they'll play a match the following year, and the only date that they suggest is the 27th of April, as you say, but they say they are also playing a match the previous day in Paris against France, which ends in a 3-3 draw. But to kind of basically soothe our wounded ego should we be upset by this, they said that both teams will be of equal standard. But really, in the Italian history books, this goes down as a B team selection.
But in the Irish history books, this goes down as a full international.
Yes, absolutely. So again, we're talking about the vagaries of what is awarded full international status and not. This is a B team. Now, we should say that every player on this Italian side had been either previously capped or will be capped by their A team. So it is a strong side. It is well represented from the main Italian clubs of the day, but possibly shows the estimation they have of Irish football after their 3-0 win the previous year, that they're sending a second string to play us in Dublin. Right.
The Irish are not going to be that good of a side that we have to worry about. So the team: Frank Collins from Jacobs, Alec Kirtland, Shamrock Rovers, they're both making their debuts. Frank Brady, Liam Brady's granduncle there, from Forsons, he's playing. William Glenn, Shamrock Rovers, making his debut. Mick O'Brien from Derby County, we'll come back at him in a second because you think he's actually potentially English born and pretended that he was born in Ireland. But anyway, which would have been the requirement of the day. Mick O'Brien, Derby County, so an English side is represented here for the first time. Tommy Muldoon, Aston Villa, another English side. So this kind of creeping into the lineup.
And we remember Tommy Muldoon and a few others from our Olympic episodes. These are guys. Tommy was at Athlone Town. He does quite well at the Olympics, and after that he's signed by Aston Villa.
Billy Lacey, Shelburne. Now, do I have in my notes here how old he was?
37.
Now, anybody there listening is 37 and still has aspirations to play for Ireland. He is the person to emulate. 37 years of age, gets his debut. Harry Duggan, Leeds United. It says here it's his first cap of a Steve Martin now from Bowness United, the Scottish team.
Christy Martin. So Bowness, who no longer exist, who were at the time in the Scottish second division. They're going great guns. They're about to get promoted. Christy Martin is banging in the goals. So I think he scores 34 goals that season in their promotion charge.
Good man,
and he's also just been capped by the IFA.
Right.
So he's selected for them. Prior to this game, he scored a hat trick against, I think, Cowdenbeath in the Scottish second tier. So he's a man on form, and a lot is expected of him. He's leading the line. Again, he's most likely, we think he's another Midlander. We think he's born in Athlone, but it looks like, kind of like Patsy Gallagher, he moves to Scotland as a young man, plays junior football in Scotland, gets selected for Bowness, briefly plays for Falkirk, goes back to Bowness, has somewhat of a tragic end, which we might talk about a little bit later.
What happens to him?
Well, I suppose Christy Martin, he has this successful career. He helps Bowness get promoted to the Scottish top flight. They finish second last and get relegated in their only season in top flight football. The step up seems to be a little bit too much for him. He only scores 7 goals in 30 odd games, but they're a struggling side. Like many players we've talked to, he works a second job apart from football. He's not just a professional footballer. He's working on the docks in Glasgow and Clydeside, and he basically falls into the hull of a ship and suffers a severe head injury, which effectively ends his footballing career. And he dies quite young as well. And we might talk about it a bit later. Some of these players have very short and tragic lives. It's Hobbesian, it's brutal and short.
Yeah, it's a precarious life. I mean, the life expectancy would be much shorter than it is today.
I think Christie actually gets hit by a bus in his early 50s and is killed in Glasgow. And look, this was not sadly uncommon. We're going to encounter more and more of these players who have very short lives, unfortunately.
So Bob Fulham, Shannon Grover's the second cap, and Joe Kendrick, Everton.
So Joe Kendrick, we remember from the game against Bulgaria. Yes, he gets injured and goes off. He was playing for Brooklyn.
And the much maligned Frank Gent comes on.
The much maligned. So Joe Kendrick gets his move from Brooklyn to Shelbourne. He does very well for Shelbourne, wins the league title with them. Is signed by Everton for the princely sum of £500. Has a couple of seasons with Everton, but doesn't really break into the first team. But he is capped there while he's at Goodison Park. And I suppose we should say we have 4 cross-channel players, and there's big hope that this cross-channel experience is going to strengthen the Irish side, which is fair enough to say. But the players who are released, Mick O'Brien, Tommy Muldoon, Harry Duggan and Joe Kendrick, are all reserve team players. Now Harry Duggan will go on and have a great career for Leeds United, but he really doesn't nail down a first team place till 1929, 1930.
It's possibly why they let them go, because they weren't playing.
Okay. Mick O'Brien has just joined Derby County, so he's in and out of the team, but he has a great game. And Joe Kendrick isn't playing for Everton, and Tommy Muldoon is in and out of the Aston Villa team. I should say actually Tommy Muldoon, a World War I veteran as well. He lies about his age, so as we were saying, there's a lot of this in the Olympic squad. When he's signed, he's basically telling them he's 24, and in fact he was 27 when he signed for Aston Villa.
Just on the reserve thing, just so people understand, in that era and basically up until the 60s, the first 11 played, and there wasn't a case of sort of you coming off the bench for 5 minutes or 15 minutes. That just didn't happen.
We have 5 substitutions now. It wasn't really a thing back then.
No, now there is a substitution in this game that we talk about, but it was relatively unusual. Now, so I'll give the pretext as mentioned here in No Foreign Game by James Quinn. Some of the entertainment that happens around this game by the notoriety is quite the thing.
Just to put in context, though, I want to say one thing. We were talking about how much of a gap there is between matches.
Yeah.
We actually turned down an invitation to play an international game against Germany because, and we tell them a porky pie. We tell them that we have a full international calendar already. We don't.
It's a total lie.
But what we think happens here, and what Peter Byrne argues in his book Green is the Colour, is that we're trying to curry favour with the British associations. They've objected to the defeated powers in the First World War, like Germany and Austria, rejoining FIFA, and we're trying to get a lucrative match against maybe England or Scotland here in Dublin, which would be a big crowd draw, pack out stadiums, and we're trying to curry favour with them. So we turn the Germans down. Now we changed our view on that very shortly, but we think that's why they turned down a match against Germany. Important to remember, Italy are not a defeated power. They are on the Allied side in the First World War.
Right.
They are, in theory, victorious after World War One. They get a bit of extra territory in the Treaty of Versailles. So that's a bit of the context.
Okay.
And we're going to talk to Chris, who's going to give us a bit more historical background on this. But important to remember, Mussolini is in charge. He has been in charge for about 5 years by this stage.
Even though he escaped an assassination attempt from a Dublin woman.
Which we mentioned in the previous episode.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so it says return fixture because we played against Italy the previous year. On the 23rd of April 1927, eagerly anticipated, and the visitors were accorded a degree of official recognition. On the 22nd of April, they were received by Governor-General T.M. Healy at the Vice-Regal Lodge in the Phoenix Park. Healy described the Italians as a powerful lot of boys who would take some beating, but regretted he could not attend the game owing to a prior engagement. However, Kevin O'Higgins, the influential Minister for Justice, who would be assassinated 3 months later by IRA dissidents, accepted an invitation to attend. And during the ban, so the GA ban, so it's not a small decision for him to make. The Irish Independent commented that the recognition extended to the game by the government, the reception accorded the Italian visitors by the Governor-General, and many other ceremonies connected with the match marked it as something out of the ordinary in our soccer world. The FAIFS, the Football Association of the Free State, had expected a large crowd, and with Dalymount Park still in need of substantial development, nothing ever changes, the IRFU allowed it to use Lansdowne Road. An enthusiastic crowd of over 20,000 saw Italy win 2-1 So I'll come back to the after match dinner in a minute, but it's in Lansdowne Road, which is
just to say with Dalymount. So what's happening in 1927 is that a group of investors, well, what would you say? No, a group of Bowes members and committee members basically take on a personal bond each, including Alfie Byrne, who we'll mention later. Alfie Byrne, an interesting man who was on the Bowes committee, but was also vice president of Shamrock Rovers at the same time. Alfie Byrne trying to be all things to all people. But they go a personal bond, a great number of them, Ernie Crawford, Bertie Kerr, who we mentioned, and a lot of other people, to basically develop the main stand at Dalymount. So they raise, I think it's a very large sum, about close to £20,000 to redevelop a big chunk of Dalymount on the view that it's going to become the national stadium. So that's what's being referenced there. And if you're ever in Dalymount, if you go to the Jackie Jemison bar, there's a huge frame portrait of all those gentlemen, and because they were all men, in acknowledgement that the fact that they put their personal financial selves on the line to basically redevelop Dalymount as a national stadium fit for international
But there
games.
was a time during the 50s when Dalymount was considered one of the best football grounds in these islands. It was it had a great reputation. Anyway, it's the first soccer game in Lansdowne Road since 1900.
Yes,
when Ireland lost 2-0 to England. So it's not a very frequent soccer venue, but it is anyway the host of this match. So 20,000 people, the referees from Belgium, and the match report reads as follows.
Well, we should mention the referee is significant because it's John Langenus, who has he will referee the next year's FAI Cup final in 1928, which between Bowes and Drumcondra, which Bowes will win. But of more significance, he referees the World Cup final against Argentina and Uruguay in 1930.
So the guy who referees the FAI Cup final in 1928 then referees the World Cup final
2 years later, yeah.
That's hilarious. And there was a row over the ball, I remember that much.
Yeah, you had to different ball in each half. An Argentinian ball in the first half, a Uruguayan ball in the second half.
Great stuff. Anyway, a frantic opening saw, now my Italian, come here, you're going to have to help me here. Pastore. I'm
going to say Pastore.
Hit the crossbar, and Fulham have a header saved by Gianni before Ireland opened the scoring after 6 minutes. Yes! It's like Stuttgart 88.
Yes.
Okay. Kendrick beat Giordani and crossed from Martin to shoot. The centre forward shot was blocked, but the ball rebounded to Fulham, who shot high into the net. 1-0. The Italians fought back, and Pastore had a header kicked off the line by Frank Brady. Captain that day. Before the infill, Zanello was knocked unconscious. Again, this unconscious thing.
Yeah, so we had the previous match, we had John Joe Flood and one of the Italian players get knocked out. So Mario Zanello, who's playing for a team called Pro Vercelli, who are based near Turin. Pro Vercelli are one of the dominant sides of the 70s, or the 20s, sorry, but kind of eventually get eclipsed. But yeah, he gets a blast of a Bob Fun free kick.
Hit him in the head.
And he's knocked out.
So he's carried off and replaced by a substitute. Controversial, because there weren't that many substitutes in those days. Maybe because it's a friendly, maybe because they're trying to be nice.
It's what seems, and this is my take on it, and we'll come to it again when we're...
No mention of this in Italian records, it says here.
Yeah, comes to the Dutch game. But Zanello goes off, and he's replaced by a guy called Gianangelo Barzon, who is an AC Milan player. But I think the custom is that if it's agreed between the two nations, if someone is injured before half time, they can be subbed off. But it tends to happen in friendlies. It does happen in one of the games we're going to come to where Ireland are playing the Netherlands. Billy Jordan, who's a Bowes player, gets injured in the first half and is replaced by actually his Bowes club teammate Fred Horlacher in the first half. But it generally doesn't happen if it's after half time, and it's limited.
I don't want to be unfair, but I think we made a mistake there. That was a strategic mistake. If a guy gets knocked unconscious and there's no requirement for a substitute, I know it's like
we should have said play on.
You know what I mean? Beat us 3-0 last time. This is important for the home crowd. Anyway,
people didn't know about the dangers of concussion and head injury back then. And all
okay, in the second half, Revolta, Pastore and Wojak. Now he's an interesting chap, we'll come back to him.
Yes.
Set up Monorati to shoot, and when this was blocked, the winger followed up to score. With 10 minutes left, Monorati scored a soft goal to give the Italians victory. So we're 1-0 up.
Yes.
And the guy gets knocked unconscious.
And we let him be swapped out.
Then we lose 2-1.
And what happens is as well, Tommy Muldoon, who we've mentioned, the guy who lies about his age aside for Aston Villa, he gets injured in the second half. We don't sub him out, and he kind of is a passenger. He's stuck out in the wing, and we're effectively playing with 10 men.
Right, and Wojak was actually born in Croatia.
Yeah, so what we're saying, we were talking about Italy being on the victory.
Vogliani was his name that he gave himself later because of anti-Slavic laws.
And we'll talk about this with Chris when he comes on. Chris Lee, author of Defiant: A Story of Fascism Against Football Against Fascism, I should say. So, as we're saying, Mussolini's in power. Italy have been on the victorious side in the First World War. They get an area called Istria, which is kind of part now of modern day Croatia. And guys like Antonio Vojak, as you say, his name has changed because it's a process of Italianization. Mussolini wants people using Italian names. Right. So in modern day football, he'd be a Croatian. But because Italy gained this territory after the Treaty of Versailles, he's a Juventus player, and Vojak kind of sticks out with names like Munarati and Pastore next to him and so on. But
so we lose the game. And we're after losing 2 games now in 2 years against the Italians. So
this lad Munarati, the Juve player, scores twice against us.
Yeah.
One thing we should mention that it's a bit of a soft goal we give away. The winner. Yeah. So Frank Collins, the Jacobs goalkeeper, who we met in our first game against Glasgow Celtic.
Friend of the pod.
Yeah. Former Glasgow Celtic keeper himself. Collins is playing for Jacobs. Interesting. He is a veteran in World War One. He's part of the medical corps. And he's seriously injured, and one of his former teammates, Ernie McKay, who plays in some of the early matches, he plays in the Irish League against the Welsh League game. He basically says that Collins was slow to get down on a certain side because of this injury he had suffered when he was working as an ambulance man and things like that in the First World War. Okay. He blames it on that, but it is a soft goal that Collins gives away.
I'd know 100 years later, but 98 years later, and I'm still feeling the pain of this.
Of losing to Italy.
Well, I am, yeah.
One of our first home internationals.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually wearing a jersey from the day time we beat them 1-0. And that's actually, yeah. Anyway, so now there's a bit of a shindig afterwards.
Yes.
And it's a bit of a. I don't want to be unfair to the participants, and of course this is pre World War II.
Yeah, there's a danger to read history backwards, knowing what comes next.
But it feels like a bit of a quasi-fascist shindig, a bit of a we're all in this together, lads.
Yes.
Right. So I'll read what it has here in the No Foreign Game book by James Quinn. Okay. So afterwards, the visiting party, and because it's all new. To the FAI.
So they're putting on a good spread. They want to make a good first impression on their Italian sophisticated
so the rugby crowd have this all the time because they have England and Scotland and Wales coming over, right? So they do these sort of events, right? Yeah. And the great and the good of Irish civil life, the political classes, etc., are used to going to these events, right? And maybe the All Ireland finals in the GAA will be similar. This is unusual. Okay, they haven't had a game of this nature before because the previous one was kind of a hastily arranged friendly in 1924.
Yes.
So this, we might suggest, is the first one that is given the proper status of a home international again in Nelson Rose. Anyway, so the visiting party was entertained at a dinner in the Royal Hibernian Hotel.
If people know Dawson Street, where the Royal Hibernian Way is now, that's where the Hibernian Hotel used to be. Okay. Very posh.
The government was represented by Kevin O'Higgins, flanked by an eclectic mix of dignitaries, several of them Italophiles or fascist sympathisers.
Yep.
Again, this is 26 now, so let's not have our post-Holocaust heads on us when we're thinking about fascism in the 20s. But still, you know, a bit of a doctrine which I'm sure even at the time people were a little bit sceptical of. Okay, so they included the independent Dublin TD Alfie Byrne, a regular attender of soccer matches, Osmond Grattan Esmond, a government TD and keen supporter of both soccer and Mussolini, the pro-fascist Professor Walter Starkey, who lectured in Italian literature at TCD, and General William Richard English Murphy, I love these names, Deputy Commissioner of An Garda Síochána. Deputy Commissioner of An Garda Síochána is General William Richard English Murphy, who had served with the British Army on the Italian front in the Great War. The proceedings were marked by considerable nationalist hyperbole on all sides.
Can I join in with my little post here from the Irish Times report of that? So again, General W.R.E. Murphy, veteran of the First World War. Michael Collins recruits him during the War of Independence. He's also a general in the Irish Army during the Civil War. He's based in charge of Kilmallock, Battle of Kilmallock, and then he becomes head of the DNP. And he's responsible for cleaning up vice in what was known as the Monto, and then he's Deputy Garda Commissioner for the rest of his career.
By vice, you mean prostitution?
Yes, the red light district and so on.
Okay.
Him and Frank Duff going down there and cleaning up, well, what they would call cleaning up, basically shutting down all the brothels.
Frank Duff being of the Legion of Mary.
Legion of Mary, exactly. So, the proceedings were marked by much enthusiasm, particularly when the orchestras played the Italian national anthem and later when the Italians rose and rang out the anthem of the Fascisti. An interesting feature was the presentation to Sir Henry McLaughlin on behalf of the Governor of Rome of a piece of bronze statuary which the Vice President of the Italian Federation said symbolised the spirit of Rome and the voice of the people of Italy speaking to the people of the Irish Free State. Just to say as well, very interesting, Sir Henry McLaughlin, and we were talking earlier today about Douglas Hyde, about something else. Sir Henry McLaughlin was head of recruitment for the British Army in Ireland during the First World War.
Right.
He is seen as kind of a someone who can mend fences with the IFA, that someone would be respected north of the border as well. But he is also a very dedicated football fan, which is, this is Sir Henry McLaughlin. There's no escaping that. Osmond Esmond Grattan, who you mentioned.
Yes.
He is a descendant of Henry Grattan.
Okay.
And he is an FAI board member. Actually, one of the other kind of...
He's a humdinger of a quote here.
Oh, yeah, and one last one as well. So we have Alfie Byrne, who, if you can Google Alfie Byrne blue shirt salute, him and Ona Duffy, if you really want to. We also have Alistair McCabe, who was a Sinn Féin candidate, was the guy who tried to spark off a 96 Rising in Sligo. He later becomes very involved in the blue shirt movement, and he's actually imprisoned during the early 1940s because he's considered so much of a German sympathiser. On a complete side note, he's also the founder of the Educational Building Society. Anyway, big football fan,
EBS.
Very involved in Sligo Rovers.
EBS. Okay. Yes. So, Grattan Esmond described the match as an epoch-marking event in the history of association football in the Irish Free State, while General Murphy paid tribute to the football skills of the Italian players and the fighting spirits of Italian soldiers, which he had witnessed himself in the Piave River in 1918. Like, what kind of a bash was this?
So
they all get completely tanked and decided to sort of
and they're singing and toasting
speak off the top of their heads. Many speeches was there. On behalf of the Italian delegation, Paolo Ingleri Graziani spoke of the two countries' long struggles for independence and how sport could help the two peoples to defend the freedom they had won. The Italian national anthem and the fascist anthem were loudly sung and applauded. There were similar scenes the following day. This is like a kind of a county final going into the Wednesday.
Yeah.
There are similar scenes the following day as the Italian party sailed from Dunleary. A large crowd sang fascist songs and all gave the ancient gladiatorial and modern fascisti salute, the right hand outstretched. My God.
Just like that Battle of the River Piave, right? If anyone's ever read Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway,
I can assume sort of equating a football match with that was a bit silly.
1 million men either side battling across this river in Italy. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, over 20,000 people killed, over 100,000 injured.
That'll happen. But like one guy gets knocked unconscious in this game. That's it.
Ernest Hemingway is at that battle as an ambulance man. A shell lands, knocks him unconscious. He wakes up and the two Italian lads he's standing next with are blown to smithereens. This is how violent it was. But William Richard Murphy is at that battle as a combatant, and he has a great, very hyperbolic and overblown speech about how that was a great sporting victory in its own way, and wasn't a different sporting victory in Lansdowne Road for the Italians and all this stuff. So it's real overwrought, it's real grandiose. But you got to remember, Italy has been a big supporter of Ireland getting into FIFA,
right?
And well, let's be honest. Like, I mean, we're 1927 now. We're only 5 years away from, very not that far off from, like, if you think about it, a kind of fascist push as Fianna Fáil are elected into government, and the Army Comrades Association, the White Army, the Blue Shirts, whatever you want to call them, did at the time when they were at their highest point, when they had over 40,000 members, when they're one of the largest right-wing.
I'm not going to comment on any of this, by the way.
Yeah, this is all.
I'm sick of the football. Yeah. Come on, go for it.
But that's there. So I mean, we are very lucky that we didn't have a kind of a fascist party in Ireland, but we didn't come that far away from it in some ways.
That's possibly the greatest achievement at that time was the peaceful transfer of power in 1932.
There was
no guarantee
yes,
in the years previous to that was going to happen.
And look, we'll talk to Chris, because by the time we get to like the 1930s, when you think about so much of
because
Europe,
O'Higgins was going to be assassinated in a few weeks' time, so like, you know, the sense of overthrow of the state was real.
It was a real thing. The peaceful transfer of power wasn't guaranteed, and you look what happens in the following years in Europe. You have Dollfuss in Austria, you have Horthy in Hungary, you have what happens in Germany, which we'll come on to obviously. So
it's all kicking off.
Franco in Spain, of course. So all this is happening. This is not happening outside of a wider context.
So the game is actually more sort of renowned for the festivities afterwards.
Festivities afterwards, and they'll get knocked unconscious by Bob Fulham's free kick.
Run of themselves. Anyway, so we're off and running as in official history of having played a game against the second Italian side, losing 2-1, but we got a goal ahead.
Yeah.
And so look, the Irish side now are kind of established as an international side, but again, it's effectively one game a year. We play in 28 against Belgium, we play in 29 against Belgium, we play against 1930
against Belgium. These players,
one international a year.
Yeah, exactly.
But simultaneously they're playing for the IFA and their home internationals.
Yeah, so we're looking at that team. So I mean, Harry Duggan will be capped by the IFA. Christy Martin, who we mentioned, is capped by the IFA.
Billy Lacey is capped by the IFA.
Exactly. Mick O'Brien. So Mick O'Brien claims to have been born in Kildare and claims to be son of in a military family. We know he did serve in the British Army, but it seems more likely, and with a name like Michael O'Brien, there's a very good chance he does have Irish connections and probably would have been qualified under a granny rule. But it seems more likely that rather than being born in the Curragh of Kildare, he was born in County Durham in England, and that he was perhaps the first English-born FAI capped international. Now, Michael O'Brien has a great game. He's probably the standout player in this Irish team. He's about 6 foot tall. He's a very skilled, powerful, strong, but technically gifted centre half. He's the standout guy in this game. William Saki Glenn makes his debut, a Rovers player who doesn't have a great game but will have a very successful Irish career. But Mick O'Brien, again, another guy who's like, you think he's dead at 41. He just, another tragic death and things like that. So it's like I said, it's Hobbesian. Life is brutal and short for a lot of these guys, but a very interesting team. And like I said, it's the first time we've actually managed to successfully secure the release of players from British clubs. It'll become an ongoing challenge, but at least we got a few.
Okay. And now we're going to turn to our interview.
So we're going to talk to Chris, because we've been talking a lot about fascism and Mussolini and things like that. And to put it in maybe wider context, is a man who's literally written a book on the subject, and football and fascism and how the two interconnected and conflicted. So we'd like to welcome to the pod author, podcaster, Chris Lee. And we're welcoming to the pod now Christopher Lee, author, podcaster, author of Defiant, the story of football against fascism. So who better to talk to about what was happening in Italian football at the time? Mussolini, the March of Rome in 1922. So we're 102 years after that. And this had major impacts on Italian football, Chris. So maybe tell us, where was Italian football at in the early 1920s, and what changes Mussolini Institute, and how did that lead to success they experienced in the 1930s, winning 2 World Cups? How much can we credit Mussolini for that, and what other changes did it make to the game?
Firstly, thanks for having me on. You've both been very helpful and generous with your time for my current project, so it's nice to be able to give back in some way. This is a really fascinating and interesting period of history, and I think we have to take the whole context of nation building into account, because Italy was a very young country at this point. It had only been founded through the Risorgimento, which is the kind of coming together under a guy called Giuseppe Garibaldi, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm going to come back to him in a minute because there's football.
He of biscuit fame.
Sorry?
He of biscuit fame.
He is the biscuit fame, yes, although there's more to him than that.
It's always biscuits. I mean, between the players playing for Jacobs for Ireland and the biscuit guy, yeah. Anyways,
the interesting thing is it's obviously like it's quite a young country. Although everyone thinks, it's really old because the Romans and the Etruscans and all that sort of lots of pottery and things like that. Actually, it's been a country of disparate states. So the concept of Italy was a big thing in the early 19th century, but bear in mind it was carved up, right? So the Austrians there, Napoleon's there. The Spanish royal family have got parts of it, I think Naples and that sort of area, bits of Sardinia. So it's only really Italy that comes together in the 1860s as a country. So by the time Mussolini comes around 6 decades later, he's this kind of the first nationalist, I guess, leader, his first fascist, definitely. And he wants to say, no, now we've made Italy, we need to make Italians. So this is where he's trying to sort of create a sense of nationhood, and we'll come to that, because the Carta di Viareggio, which is the sort of Charter of Viareggio, which is a coastal town near Genoa, of 1926, really set out the template for what we know now as Italian football, so Serie A, Coppa Italia, so one national league, one national cup competition. There was a kind of cup competition, but it wasn't really that sort. That ingrained really. The interesting thing, just before we go off on the Garibaldi and the football front, and I don't know if you saw, Jerry, my post on this, a number of clubs, at least 6 clubs in the world, wear red because of Garibaldi, and most of their fans probably don't even know it, which is Nottingham Forest, and their fans are very aware that they got their colours from Garibaldi because he wore red, and they kind of named themselves that. One of their fan groups is called that. They gave their colours to a certain club called Woolwich Arsenal, who in turn gave theirs to another local side at that point called Charlton Athletic. And Sparta Prague's boss, and also Braga in Portugal, came over and watched the Arsenal and decided to wear red on that account. Down in South America, when Forest toured in the 1900s, the boss of Independiente was there, and he decided to adopt red as well. So there's at least 6 countries that are wearing red because of Garibaldi, and as far as I know, he didn't even watch a football match because football didn't arrive in Italy till really, really late. That's about 1890s at this point. So bear in mind, what's the oldest club in Ireland is Cliftonville, 1879. So, a couple of decades head start on Italy at this point, because the oldest club is, it's Genoa Cricket Football Club. Started off as Genoa Football and Athletic Club, was Athletic and Cricket Club, which was 1893. That's what they've got on their badge, but they didn't actually play football until 1897, when a guy from East London called James Richardson Spenceley, which is a great name given that James Richardson was the one that introduced a lot of us to football in Football Italia in the 90s. But he was a doctor. He got them playing football. The same time that he was doing that in Genoa, just up the road in Milan, there was another scene, and Turin, there was a scene going on, again with a strong Nottingham connection. A Swiss-Italian student called Edoardo Boscio, who was working in Nottingham in the textile industry, went back to Italy, tried to teach people how to play it. He formed a club called Torinese, as in of Turin, but nothing to do with the current FC Torino. Meanwhile, another guy, Herbert Kilpin, who a lot of people may be familiar with, he founded AC Milan, so in 1899. So there's, again, red comes into that, and also black. The black and white, as you know, is Notts County, and of course they ended up giving their shirts to Juve, who's another of the older teams. I think 1897 they came around as well. So there's kind of this nascent scene, but by the time we're talking about 1920s, it's Italy is. I mean, now we think, oh yeah, great powerhouse, 4 times world champions, but actually they weren't really anything particular. They certainly weren't part of the new wave of European football like you get from the Danubian scene, like Austria and Hungary, strong sides at that point. And certainly Italy wouldn't be counted amongst that. So this is why you see Mussolini going, right, what can we use as a tool to sort of make ourselves stronger, to unify the country, to bring us together under kind of one banner. And sports was a big part of that, especially in the 30s, which obviously this is before the 30s, at the time you're talking about, 1926, 27. So football isn't strong. They've only been playing international football since 1910, and not particularly successfully either. So that's kind of where we're at by the 1926. But it's interesting because the fascists start getting into motion, build the format for what's to come. So by 1926, the foundation of Fiorentina, which is a merger of 2 clubs. They wanted one strong team from Florence. They wanted one strong team from Rome. They founded AS Roma out of 3 clubs. Certain other clubs called SS Lazio decided they didn't want to join them, and that wasn't because they're big anti-fascists. They obviously had fascists on all the boards at this point. They just wanted to be independent of it. So that at least gave us Rome's biggest derby, one of the world's biggest derbies anyway. So that's where we're at by 1926, 27. So I'd still consider it quite nascent at that point.
But so the years we're talking about, 26, 27, when they're playing Ireland, they're creating a unified national league that isn't regionalised for the first time. You're talking about the creation of the Coppa Italia, and you're talking about mergers of clubs so that each city at least has one strong club. And then obviously there's a whole raft of like stadium building at this time from the late 20s into the 30s as well.
Mm-hmm. And some of those, a lot of the people involved in like Leonardo Abernathy, who is, I think, is the head of FIGC, which is the FIGC, the Italian FA, effectively. He was obviously with Mussolini. He was behind the construction of the wonderful stadium in Bologna, which is still there. The Artemio Franchi, which is now it's called in Florence, again, these beautiful Art Deco stadiums. You can date them from so it's not called Art Deco in Italy because it's the difference between Art Deco and Art Nouveau looks forward and futuristic, whereas the Italian style of that thing looks backwards and harks back to the sort of Roman era. So there is a difference, even though stylistically they look similar. So it's not Art Deco.
Just to say as well, the word fascist comes from the fasces, which is the bundle of reeds that was bundled around the axe, which was a symbol of Roman power that the bodyguards of the Roman emperor, the Roman consuls would have. So the word fascism is an Italian word. This is the origin of this political movement, and obviously this ideology spreads out throughout Europe through the 20s and 30s. And look, we're looking forward. I suppose I always talk about the danger of reading history backwards, but we're looking forward to the matches that Ireland are going to be playing in the 20s and 30s, and an awful lot of games against nations that are going to be under fascist and dictatorial right-wing rule. But it begins with Mussolini, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, and one of the factors that you'll be probably covering, and it affected the Irish Free State team as well as the England team, was the whole saluting business, and that was introduced in 1925 by a guy called Landro Ferretti, who was the head of the CONI, which is the Italian Olympic Association at that point. And he said, like, he's kind of invoking Roman imperial past and therefore like getting everyone to salute. And one of the people that refused to do this at the opening of what is now the Artemio Franchi in Florence in 1931 was a guy called Bruno Neri who refused to do it. And so there's a very famous photo of the ground being opened against a team called Admira from Vienna, and he's just the only one in the line not with his arm in the air. That kind of limited his career at this point, and he ended up at a club called Lucchese with a lot of other people who were kind of not on board politically. Lucchese was in the third division at that point under a guy called Erno Egri-Erbstein, who very famous Hungarian Jewish coach, who was one of the few foreigners allowed in, because one thing we haven't mentioned at this point is the whole concept of banning foreign players and banning foreign coaches. He was allowed, and then there was another way that they got around hiring foreign players to strengthen both the national side and the domestic side, and that was the Oriundi or the Rimpatriati, which was basically anyone of Italian descent, many of whom were in South America.
So this is the granny rule, really. I mean, it's a charge often levelled at Ireland, especially under Jack Charlton, but the Italians were doing this in the 20s and 30s.
Oh, and they're still doing it now. I mean, who was the last Englishman to win the World Cup? It was Simone Perrotta from Ashton-under-Lyne in 2006.
Yeah, Christian Vieri was
born in Australia.
Yeah. He was Australian. Yeah. I mean, the Welsh guy, what's his name? Giorgio Chinaglia, who played.
Yeah, from Swansea.
Yeah, exactly. So there's.
Well, we got Tony Cascarino, I suppose.
Terry Mancini.
There's a long history of it, and they kind of done it, for quite a lot of it throughout the history. But this was at the start of it, and obviously South American players had probably the first area outside Europe to really succeed. Obviously, Uruguay won the gold back to back in the 20s at the Olympics, which was then the de facto World Cup. Then won the World Cup in 1930. So someone who'd lost the 28 final and the 30 final, Luis Monti, who's Argentinian, ended up playing for Italy. He famously kind of broke his foot in the match we're going to talk about, I'm sure, called the Battle of Highbury, after just a few minutes. And then there's another one called Raimundo Orsi, who in the same Battle of Highbury missed a chance to equalise later on. So he ended up playing for the Italian national side and helped to strengthen it, and that's kind of like setting the path towards the 1934 World Cup win.
Yeah, so let's just focus on that, because you're saying obviously Italy only playing international football since 1910, aren't a world power yet, but in the space of 6-7 years, they go from basically creating a national league to being world champions. And I suppose, and obviously you're saying they're recruiting players with Italian connections from Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, things like that. But how does that great victory come about? And you mentioned the Battle of Highbury there before. This is Italy versus England in Highbury in London, and it's kind of an infamous game, really.
Yeah, it is. So I guess the route to the World Cup is Italy didn't go to the 1930 World Cup, and in the late 20s, I think you're looking at, like I said, the groundwork being done for what happens in the 1930s. They don't go. They strangely as well for the 1934 World Cup, and no time since, as hosts, they had to qualify. So they beat Greece 4-0, and then Greece pulled out. So it gave them a bit of a pass out. And obviously, there's lots of controversy around the 1934 win, particularly around the semi-final.
Because they're hosting.
Yeah. And Mussolini himself wasn't even into football that much. He didn't go to the after party when they won the World Cup. And it wasn't even the number one sport. Cycling was it. Giro d'Italia was on at the same time, and that was kind of dominating the press. Not entirely knocking football. Football was on some of the sports front pages, but not exclusively, if you know what I mean. So again, bear in mind, the World Cup was still nascent. Some places, especially the British associations, didn't take it seriously and didn't enter it. And that's how you get the Battle of Highbury, because Italy wanted to prove that they were the best. And the world, for some reason, assumed that England was at that point. And maybe they were there, like Danny Matthews and then Hapgood and all those sort of people. So they went to Highbury, and England missed a first-minute penalty. Then they, I think it still were 3 up within 12 minutes, but by this point, Luis Monti was kind of off the pitch. So Italy did have 10 men. Pulled 2 back for the famous Giuseppe Migliazza, who obviously is San Siro's alternative name, from a team called Ambrosiana, which was the Mussolini era name for Internazionale, because he decided that everyone should, he took the English names out of all the Italian clubs.
So he wanted them named after the patron saint of Milan, rather than something international like Internazionale.
Yes, which was Swiss founded, as a sort of breakaway from an English-founded club. So yeah, he didn't want that. And likewise, Milan Cricket and Football Club became Associazione di Calcio Milano. So it's like there was no AC Milan. So they went back to Milan after the war, but kept the AC bit. So ditched the cricket. Can't understand. So 1934. So I've got a very long-winded way of saying it. They were 3-2. It finished. Orsi missed a game at the last. Kind of lost, but it wasn't no sort of love lost between them. They'd never played each other before at this point, and I don't quite know where the violence came from. But Stanley Matthews said it was. Given how long Stanley Matthews played for, he was 53 when he retired. He said it was the most violent match he'd ever been involved in. So it was really unruly by the sounds of it. It's interesting. It's held at Highbury. I mean, Wembley had been built in 1923 and did host the FA Cup final, but it wasn't built for football. Everyone seems to forget this. It wasn't used for internationals until after World War II. So, it used to rotate around the London ground, mostly the London grounds, which is why you got, like England, very controversial game the following year, with England versus Germany at White Hart Lane, which is,
where the Nazi flag, the swastikas pulled down and all that sort of stuff.
Yep, that's right, exactly. These were interesting times. I don't think anything was settled, no debates were settled from, England went away feeling they were still the best side, but in Italy, Italy was seen as sort of like they were sort of lionised for their sort of
fighting qualities.
Yes, it's like only lost. We played with 10 men and it wasn't fair. Blah blah blah, that sort of thing. So they did play each other again in Milan later in the 30s, and again at this point the salute was done for a second time by England, having done it in Berlin a year earlier. All for a sort of appeasement reasons at this point. This was the late 30s by this point. And Italy had, by this point, won 2 World Cups. So kind of like there's no asterisk against the second one, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, because they win it in France. They're not popular in France. There's a lot of Italian expats who've fled because of Mussolini, who are shouting abuse at them and barracking them. So if you say they have the home team advantage in 34, they certainly don't have that in 38.
No, and also in 38, they've obviously won the Olympics, which is the amateur competition at this point, and wearing black. But also in 1938, by this point, Italy is involved quite heavily in Spain, Spanish Civil War. So there's lots of Spanish emigres as well, not just Italian ones, in France. And the Italian Air Force were involved with the bombing of, say, Guernica, which is pretty famous as one of the, not the first, it's often mistaken, it's obviously the most famous of the early civilian bombings of that era. But it wasn't the first. That was a place called Durango just down the road. But Picasso obviously immortalised it. Again, they were involved with that, and Barcelona and Valencia and other places. So they were quite heavily involved in the Spanish Civil War on the side of Franco. So it wasn't. They weren't particularly popular in France. No.
And when did football become Italy's national obsession? You mentioned cycling and other pursuits that were more popular in that period. When was the period when Italy really became, immersed in football culture and football became its number one passion?
I guess that was the 30s. By this point, it was really happening. And I'd say that was probably cemented by. I mean, they kept playing football during World War II as well. Bear in mind, Italy sort of swapped sides halfway through. And there's quite a funny story that I've got in my book about when there was a statue of, we mentioned the Bologna Stadium, which is now the Rinata d'Ara. There was a statue of Mussolini on horseback in that ground. And obviously they wanted to get rid of him. When Bologna was kind of liberated effectively or overthrew the fascists, they went in and they tried to rip the statue off. But they didn't succeed. They managed to get the weakest part of it, which is obviously the man part of it. But then what was left was the horse with Mussolini's legs. So they kind of it was left there for like 4 years before they actually removed it. That was just under the Maratona Tower, which is the famous tower, as you know, when you can visualize the stadium. So yeah, I mean, I think they kept playing during the 40s. And then at this point, just after that, you see the groundwork already for the Il Grande Torino side, the Great Torino, which was Erbstein, actually. A bit of Vittorio Pozzo involved earlier on. He was the national coach. But I think it was in the 20s, I think he was Torino boss. But Erbstein took over when he returned to Italy. And I think by that point, there were 10 of the 11 that lined up for Italy were Torino players by the time they died at Superga in 1949, 4th of May. 75th anniversary of which is upcoming.
So by this stage, football, we can say, is the kind of the secular religion of Italy. And so just to finish, Chris, like, how much do you think this is something that would have happened naturally, that football would have grown in popularity in Italy as it did in other countries, or do you think that maybe Mussolini advanced that or catalysed it a bit by his functionaries' involvement in basically unifying the leagues, creating clubs? Like, how much credit is he due for this sort of stuff? Obviously, on a basis that it's going to be something to project Italy around the world as a powerful, and all these things that the fascist regimes want to be projected as powerful and sporting and manly and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Sure.
No reasons at all. He wasn't a fan. Likewise, the people that tried to emulate him, Adolf Hitler in particular, wasn't a fan either. He went famously to one match. Franco was a fan, and kind of successfully, you could say, exploited football in the decades that followed. I would obviously not want to give any kind of praise or credit to a dictator, but yeah, I mean, the legacy is kind of there because Serie A is still going, Coppa Italia is still going. Roma, Fiorentina, they're still there in their guys, A lot of the other clubs changed their names back to their sort of like Genoa Cricket and Football Club, Internazionale. They changed their names back to Milano, we just mentioned as well, to their kind of Mussolini names. But there's still a legacy there because I think a lot of the ultra groups in Italy are kind of right wing now. And Mussolini is kind of still seen as a reference for them because he.
The Celtic fans weren't popular with Lazio over a few references to him and how he ended up.
Well, no, that's the thing, because I think I don't know, you still see statues of him around the place and things like that, don't you? And references and stuff. So it's not like
You still see Mussolini merch being sold from stalls in Rome and places like that, which is kind of jarring when you're a tourist and you see a Mussolini calendar or something like that.
Isn't it? You wouldn't get it in Germany, would you, with their sort of
You'd
equivalent?
hope not, but...
Well, no, you wouldn't. So, it's really interesting how... And I did cover this with Tobias Jones, who wrote a book about who lives in Italy, about like why he's viewed differently. And there are reasons, I think. But and you can see that the current ruling party are kind of, I don't know, it's a bit too, I don't know, keen on. So, I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one though. But the Italy because of that period are seen as a major footballing powerhouse, and they have one of the strongest leagues. Especially it peaked in the 90s. Really, that's when their most successful was. So it's long after, but still.
And only after they kind of opened back up to foreign players as well, that the ban on foreigners.
They had to do that, yeah. That was in the 80s, when Liam Brady was one of the first ones to come.
Which is what I think it was after the disaster of the '66 World Cup when they lost to North Korea.
Yeah,
they began
they blamed foreign influence again.
Yeah, too many foreign players, and in that period of the '70s, they began to restrict players. And when Brady came, he was one of the only. In the '79
of the new batch of foreign players coming in.
Who's, as we said, whose granduncle played against Italy in those two games.
Yeah.
Squaring
back to Frank Brady.
Squaring the circle there. Yeah. Squaring the circle.
Well, look, that's great, Chris. Anything else just you think that is noteworthy from that era, or before we sign off, or any other kind of interesting stories that you've discovered in your research? Again, just to promote Defiant, the story of football against fascism. Available in all good bookstores.
From the Mussolini era.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't my find necessarily, but I interviewed a guy who had been doing lots of research on women footballers in Italy in the 1930s, which was really fascinating because it was pretty much an underground kind of, practice, and they were relatively tolerated in terms of they, as you can imagine, being fascist, and especially at that point, it was very much a woman's place in the kitchen as a mother and a cook and all that sort of thing. So they didn't like the fact that women were playing football in Milan, and they're called calciatrici, and they kept playing anyway. At one point, had a crowd of 1,000 people watching them, which was quite cool, including some of the teams from visiting, the Mitropa Cup, which was a pre-runner, so pre-European Cup. That they had some other European sides watching them play, and the Ambrosiana team, as it was then, watching them. So they had to have a boy in goal. I think that was the key thing. They didn't want
you could have a full 11
throwing themselves around, so had to get a 13-year-old boy or something to go in goal instead. But yeah, no, that's good. That's quite interesting. And then it kind of, one or two of them ended up being partisans in World War II. So some quite good sort of stories from that as well. It's good that they just kept playing despite being told not to.
Yeah, I think actually it's funny you should mention that, because Bob Fulham, I understand, had a coaching role with women's football.
Yeah.
Later in his career, he managed a women's team,
and
he played in these two games.
Well, yeah. Like he'd be the celebrity referee, or he'd take the kick off to try and give the game a bit of profile. So he was involved in kind of promoting women's football early doors in Ireland, which was very slow to get going and was very restricted by the powers that be.
Yeah, and he played in both those games against Italy.
Well, that's great, Chris. Look, do you want to give a shout out again for your books as well, if any listeners want to pick up and learn more about not just Italy, but other countries and how football resisted the rise of fascism?
Yeah, so the book I think you alluded to before is called The Defiant History of Football Against Fascism. My name's Chris Lee, L-E-E. You can follow me on Twitter, Outside Right, W-R-I-T-E, which is a play on words. And my first book, if you're interested in the really deep roots of the sport, is called Origin Stories, and that came out in 2021. And it's basically a country-by-country guide to how the game got started, and that's why Italy comes so late in that book, because it was so late at picking the game up.
And I know you do have a chapter in Ireland about that as well.
I do, yes, and you're in it.
That's why I know.
Which is, I think you're in both books, actually, aren't you? Because you told me all about the You were in talking about the 1930s, which I won't want to preempt it because you'll be talking about this in future episodes, I'm sure, but what happened with the national side in the 1930s and their relationships with Germany.
We'll get to the German game
We'll get
in
to the
39
Germans.
and Bremen. And
we have to get past the Belgians first in 27, 20, or 28, 29, 30. Chris, that was brilliant. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
All the
Chris.
best.
Take care.
Cheers.
Okay, that we come to an end of another great Each Game on Its Merits episode. The two Italian games in the last 2 weeks, 926 and 927. We next turn to the Belgians, and we play Belgium in 928, 929 and in 1930. A great Belgian side who had considerable success in the Olympic Games and indeed in the World Cup in 1930. So there, the next 3 episodes of Each Game on Its Merits.